You've probably been out on a hike or maybe down by the beach and seen a beautiful sunset that you just had to stop and take a photo of. Now, you look up at the sky and you see all this color, and you look down and you see all this detail in the foreground. But when you take a picture of it and you look at your camera, suddenly the sky is completely white, or maybe the foreground is completely black and there's no information there. Well, what happened? Well, that scene has a lot of information and a huge range of light. From the lightest lights, maybe the sun, and the darkest darks being the shadows, there is a lot of light range there, and what we call that in photography is dynamic range. Now keep in mind, our eyes are amazing things, and when you pair those with our brain, we can see a huge range of light. We're going to talk a little bit about light and how what your camera sees is a lot different from what your eyes see. So I've picked a really sunny spot here, but it's also got a lot of shade. As you can see, the sun is pretty intense. I've got Melissa standing in some sun right now. And I'm going to go ahead and take a quick photo of her. All right, now go ahead and take a couple steps back into the shade. Now you see, to my eye, it looks like she is still, I can see every detail, everything looks good, but watch what happens when I take a photo. Big difference.
Now you can see in both images, the columns look the same and the sky in the background looks the same, and that's exactly what you'd expect because we didn't change any of the camera settings. The only thing that changed was our model stepped from the sunlight to the shade. So just keep that in mind the next time you're out shooting and the image on your camera doesn't match what your eyes actually see. It's a very normal thing.
Well, why is that? Our eyes are constantly scanning a scene, and they're looking at the highlights and they're looking at the shadows, and our brain is taking all that information and combining it into one cohesive image that then we see and recognize as the world in front of us. Now, why can't cameras do this? Cameras are just not the same thing as our eyes. While our eyes can scan an image and see all the information that's there, a camera just can't take in that much information. Now, most older cameras, the way they worked was they would just try and photograph a scene, and no matter if it was light or dark or what the dynamic range was, they would just try to capture everything at once. And typically, if there was a large range of light in that image, something would have to be sacrificed, whether it's the highlights or the shadows, because it just couldn't physically capture everything that was there. New cameras have gotten a lot better at capturing a larger range of light than old cameras ever could. Now these days, some cameras and even most cell phones can capture multiple exposures, combine them into one image, and we call that an HDR, or high dynamic range image. Now why is it high dynamic range? Well, typically what the camera does is it will take two or more images, one exposed for the highlights, one exposed for the shadows, combine them, and then you get the best of both worlds, so you have highlights and shadows with the proper exposure in a single image. Technology is constantly improving, and every new generation of camera that comes out is better than the previous one. But you need to know how to use what you have right now. So what we're going to talk about next is why you should care about dynamic range and how to work within the limitations of your current camera. When I'm out shooting, I have a pretty good idea, just through experience, of whether or not I'm going to be able to capture the range of light in any given scene, or if it's not going to work for me. Now, sometimes I'll look at it and I'll say, wow, like that's going to work really, really well. And other times I'll look at it and I'll say, well, I need to move my subject, or maybe I need to do something differently here and rethink this image in order to make it work. But that comes through experience. I know my gear, and I know my post-processing, and I know what my camera is capable of. Now, we just talked about HDR, and I know that I can make multiple exposures and combine them into one image and get a lot greater dynamic range than I can with just a single image. But I personally prefer not to do that. One of the reasons why is because I photograph people, and people move. And not just people. If you're photographing a tree that's blowing in the wind, or a bike rider biking by, or anything like that, that movement between different exposures can lead to a bad image that doesn't really work for HDR. Now, another reason, I personally don't think the technology is there yet. It takes a lot of work to get an image that looks just right and doesn't look fake and unnatural. And with people, the last thing I want is for an image to look unnatural. So, if I'm just taking one image, what do? How do I make a good looking image? Knowing that I'm only taking one image to capture a scene means I also have to be aware that I could be making sacrifices to my image. Now, what do I mean by that? That means I might have to choose highlights or shadows. If there's too big of a dynamic range, I probably won't be able to capture all of the highlights and the shadows in a single image, so I have to prioritize what do I want to capture. Now, as a portrait photographer, my subject almost always gets priority when I'm determining the correct exposure. Now, that might mean blowing out some highlights, or it might mean losing some shadow information, but as long as my subject looks good, that's what's most important to me. Now, a landscape photographer probably doesn't want to sacrifice the highlights or the shadows. They want to get all of the light in a single image. So they'll typically use a filter that will block the light in a certain part of the frame, reducing the intensity and allowing them to capture the entire scene in a single image. Keep in mind, most modern cameras have great built-in tools, such as histograms and blinkies, that let you see how much and what kind of information you're either losing or retaining in your images. Now, we're going to tell you how to use these along with a few different techniques to get the greatest dynamic range possible in your images.
You might come across scenes that are difficult to photograph just because of the wide range of light that that scene contains. We talked about how your camera has a limited amount of dynamic range that it can capture compared to what your eyes can see. And we have a scene here that is a great example to illustrate that in some situations you might have to sacrifice a portion of the scene. Right here we have really dark bushes to the left and the right of the statue. The statue has some midtones, and then the sky is really bright because it's an overcast day. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a tool within your camera called a histogram to analyze the scene and understand how the data is laid in that scene. And then we'll talk about what we might potentially lose in the scene and not able to capture in one shot. But before we do that, let's jump into a different scene, talk about the histograms, then we'll come back to the scene, take pictures, and understand what's going on in the camera, what we're losing, what we're retaining, and how it's laid out in the histogram. All right, so we're here in a park and we're going to talk about histograms now. What they are, how you can read them, and how you can use them for your photography. Now I have John here, he's my male model for today, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a series of shots to illustrate in each shot how the histogram is going to look like. But before I do that, let me first explain what we have here. So it's kind of a bright day, we have some highlights here and there, but I put John in a shaded area, and I have kind of a dark green background here. It looks pretty even for me to be able to take a shot, and then it's going to be easier to explain how the histogram is laid out. So what is a histogram? A histogram is basically a visual representation to see how light is distributed in your image. And from left to right, if you look at a histogram, on the left side you have the darks and the shadows, then in the middle you have the midtones, and then towards the right you have the lights. Basically, anything that's bright or the highlights are going to be to the right side of the histogram. So why would you want to use a histogram? Well, if you're out shooting, you might want to take a look at it just to understand what you might be potentially losing. It could be your darks, or maybe it's your highlights. For this particular scene, I'm going to take 3 shots. The first one is going to be basically with the camera guiding me on what it thinks is the right exposure. I'm going to use matrix metering and have the camera give me that proper exposure. For the second shot, I'm going to intentionally underexpose, and the third shot is going to be intentionally overexposing. And we're going to take a look at the 3 histograms to understand what's happening. So let's take that first shot now. John, go ahead and tilt your body just a little bit more for me. There you go, just this way. Good. All right, so let's take a look. So for this shot, my camera is saying in matrix metering that 1/320th of a second is good. I'm shooting at 1.8. So let's go ahead and take that first shot. All right, so looking at the histogram, this is a good example of what I call a good histogram. And if you look at it, you can see, well, the image itself, first of all, looks really good. The back is not blown out. We're preserving all the details. Everything is looking good as far as the image is concerned. But if you look at the histogram, you can see that we have a nice distribution of that histogram all over the place, from left to right. We don't have anything pushing to the left side, which means we're not dealing with any dark areas here. And then we don't have anything on the right side, which means we're not potentially losing information in the highlights. Now I'm going to take another shot, and this time I'm going to intentionally underexpose by about a stop. So let's see what happens. All right, so Okay, let's take another shot. All right, so looking at this image, we can see that it's pretty dark compared to the previous one. And the corresponding histogram now looks completely different compared to the previous one. Now we're pushing a lot to the left side of the histogram, and that basically means that we have a lot of darks compared to midtones or the highlights. Now we're going to take another shot and compare the histogram there with an overexposed shot. All right. Okay, so this one, now you can clearly see it's a huge difference between the darker image with the histogram pushing to the left side. In this case, we're now pushing over to the right side. Now, if you look at the image itself, it looks really bright compared to the previous one. And also, it looks brighter than the first image that we took. The histogram is now pushing way over to the right side. So what does this all mean? Well, looking at the three images, you can clearly see how each image is affecting the histogram. But does it mean that one histogram is better than the other? No. You might be shooting at night and everything is going to be dark. So your histogram is always going to be pushing to the left side, saying that you're potentially losing the shadows. That's just the way that the night scene is going to look. Whereas if you're shooting during the day, for example, and have maybe a woman in a really bright dress standing against a really bright background, say a white wall, well, the histogram is going to look always pushed to the right side. And it also doesn't mean that it's improper exposure or that maybe you're potentially losing too many highlights. So that's just something for you to keep in mind. A histogram is just the way that light is distributed in that image. It does not represent proper or improper exposure. Now that you know what histograms are, let's go back to our first scene where we have a much wider range of light and the light is much more complex than here. Alright, so we're back to where we started, and as I said before, this is a pretty complex scene just because it contains all those shadows, some midtones, and a really bright sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use my Nikon D5500 here. I'm going to take a picture first in matrix metering mode and see what the camera is going to suggest as far as its exposure. So looking at the scene and set to matrix metering, right now the camera is saying that I have to be at 1/60th of a second to capture it. So let's go ahead and take a picture, and this is at f5.6 ISO 100. Now looking at the picture, you can see that it actually looks pretty good. I've got all the midtones captured fine. I've got the right side of the trees is looking good. The left side is a little bit darker just because it's in the shadow area, and I'm definitely losing some of the sky. Now let's take a look at the histogram. And if we look at the histogram, you can see that towards the right, just like we said, we have this line that's pushing all the way to the top, which means that we are losing some data. Now that lost data is basically in the sky that's overcast. I don't particularly care for that portion of the sky right now just because I am more worried about capturing the front of the scene. But look at the midtones right there. We have a little bit there, not a whole lot going on, but a lot of the data is pushed far to the left. And the reason why is because the big portion of the scene here is occupied by these trees, and they're obviously dark, or these bushes, and they're obviously dark. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to switch the camera to spot metering, and I'm going to take a reading off of the dark side of these bushes on the left. Let's just see what it takes to capture these bushes with all the details. So looking at the metering, looks like I have to be roughly at 1/15th of a second. So I'm going to go ahead and recompose it back to where I were, and I'm going to take another shot, and this time at 1/15th of a second. Now the difference between 1/60th of a second and 1/15th is 2 stops. So let's go ahead and take a shot and let's analyze this. So at 1/15th of a second, if we look at the image, we can see that now the darker side of the bush here on the left is looking much better. I can get a lot of details there. Everything in the foreground, as far as bushes is concerned, is looking good. But I'm definitely losing some data in the midtones right here in the sculpture, and the sky is now losing a lot more data. Now the leaves that I have there up there in the trees are now getting intermingled with the sky, and it's not looking pretty. Now if I look at the histogram The histogram, as you can see, towards the left is almost empty. There's nothing in there. So I'm definitely not losing any data as far as the shadow data is concerned. I've got a lot of the midtones captured just because, again, that midtone now includes the lower part of the sculpture and then a lot of the bushes. But towards the right now, I'm pushing far more to the right. And because of that, I know that I'm losing way more data than I need. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to see, okay, well, what if I were not to lose any data in the sky, right? So what I'm going to do is, using the same spot meter, I'm going to point the camera up to the sky and see what the camera is suggesting. So it's telling me that not to blow out any highlights in the sky, I need to be at 1/500th of a second. Now, from 1/60th of a second to 1/500th of a second, we're talking about a 3-stop difference. So that's a big change right there. I'm going to go ahead and recompose to where I were, and I'm going to take another shot. And we know what to expect. Obviously, the shot is going to be really, really dark. And if I look right now at the histogram is looking completely different than the previous two. I have nothing on the right side. I'm not losing any highlights whatsoever. Basically, I'm retaining everything in that sky. But the foreground is looking completely dark. That's why this histogram is so far pushed to the left. And that's something to expect from an underexposed shot. Now, looking at the 3 images that I captured, we can clearly see that the first one, where the camera used the matrix metering mode, looks the best. It contains the most amount of information that I need. Why is that? Because, as we mentioned before, the matrix metering mode is looking at the entire scene and evaluating it and then trying to give me the best exposure, whereas spot metering is only looking at one particular spot where I'm aiming the camera. So in this case, that first image contains the most amount of information and I can work with that shot. The second image is clearly overexposed and the third image is clearly underexposed. And one important thing that I have to point out here is that if I were to photograph this exact same scene, but say that sky was really glowing with color. For example, if I were here photographing a sunset or a sunrise, and that sky was really beautiful, well, guess what? The histogram might have looked the same. Maybe my camera would have metered very similarly, but doesn't mean that it's the right exposure. In that situation, I would definitely care for the sky. I would definitely want to capture it. Right here, I really don't care for the sky. There's nothing in there. So there's no point for me to try to get the right exposure off the sky because it's an overcast day. There is no color in there, and I don't care about preserving that color. But again, if I were in a sunrise sunset situation, then I would definitely want that color. So instead of shooting at 1/60th of a second as the matrix meter here recommended in my camera, I might be shooting at, say, 1/250th of a second just to be able to preserve more information in the sky. So when you use that histogram, keep that in mind. It's a great way to look at how the data is laid out in your images, but it's not your go-to guide to determine the right exposure. Now, all this time we've been talking about histograms, but I have a confession to make. I rarely ever use them. And I know that many other photographers don't either. Why? Because histograms have their own problems. Now, you might have your camera set to capture just RAW, not RAW plus JPEG, but just RAW. And you might not realize that the image that you're looking at on the rear LCD after you capture that RAW file is actually a JPEG rendered file. What happens inside the cameras is that when you take a picture, your camera is generating a RAW file, then building a JPEG file simultaneously, and then embedding that JPEG file inside the RAW image. So what that essentially means is that whatever camera profiles and settings you have set in the camera, for example, your picture profile, maybe your contrast settings, your saturation levels, your sharpening, your active delighting, dynamic range optimizers, and everything else that you might have turned on, all of that is going to impact the rendered JPEG image. And essentially, the histogram that you're looking at is also impacted because the histogram is being read from the JPEG image, not the RAW image. And that's a huge problem because you might be looking at it, taking a picture, and if the histogram is telling you that you're losing a lot of the highlights or maybe pushing too far to the left and losing shadows, in fact, you might not be. Maybe it's just your camera settings that are impacting those severely. So, for me, that's a huge problem. And that's one of the reasons why us photographers have been asking manufacturers to provide true raw histograms for many years now, but unfortunately it's not something easy to implement, and most modern cameras are incapable of reading histograms from the raw files. So for me, that's a pretty major drawback of histograms in these digital cameras. And another thing is, if I'm going to be constantly looking at the histogram to try to get the right exposure, or what I think is the right exposure, I might not be paying attention to my surroundings. I might not be paying attention to my framing and everything else that's going on in the scene. So the histogram is actually not necessarily the best way to get the right exposure. In fact, there is no such thing as the right exposure. You saw what happened here, even in matrix metering mode, where I was getting enough of data that I could work with and I didn't care for the sky. My histogram actually was telling me that I was losing too much information to the right. And in this case, well, I don't care for the sky. But if the conditions change and I was shooting in sunrise and sunset, well, guess what? That would be completely different, and I might actually want to preserve that. So again, that histogram is not a good tool for that reason for me personally. But there's another tool that I really like using, and that tool is, believe it or not, it's the blinkies. So in my camera, whenever I look at the images, the blinkies really help for me to visually understand how much information I'm potentially losing. So in a scene like this, I have the blinkies turned on right now, and you can see that in that matrix metering mode, it's actually telling me that I'm losing portion of the sky, and I'm okay with that. But one important thing about the blinkies, and the reason why I really rely on them, especially for my landscape photography, is because usually overexposure happens in the sky. And if blinkies are glowing for the entire sky, I probably lost way too much data. And again, that's based on the JPEG image, and I understand that. But it's okay as long as I understand the fact that I might have some leg room if a portion of the scene is blinking and the other portion is not. So for capturing, say, for example, a blue sky with puffy clouds, well, the puffy clouds are usually white, and usually I would expect them to blow out and show that there is overexposure in that area. So as long as the sky itself is looking good, then I'm good. But if I'm photographing a person, for example, and I'm just dealing with maybe dark clothing and the sky is really bright, if I need to preserve that sky, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the blinkies, and if the entire sky is flashing at me, I probably lost way too much data. But if a portion of the sky is blinking and the rest of the sky is okay, then most likely I will be able to recover most of that detail. Because from my experience, I know very well that I could actually potentially get all that exposure back in post-processing and get that sky evenly lit and looking good. So that's something I know from experience, and that's my good tip for you. If you're out shooting, use those blinkies and evaluate the sky. If the entire sky is glowing, then you're probably losing way too much data. If part of the sky is getting blown out, then you might be able to recover the rest of it. You might have heard of a technique called exposing to the right, or ETTR. Now, what exposing to the right means, you're essentially using that same histogram and you're pushing your data in RAW files as far to the right as possible without clipping or without losing data. Now, that last bit is really important because you cannot lose data to do this properly. When you expose to the right, and essentially you're brightening up the scene more than usual, and by doing that, you can recover a lot of data, especially in the shadows. And when recovering the data, you compare it to, say, an image that is not exposed to the right, a standard image, and the one that's exposed to the right, if you try to recover both, you will see that the one that's exposed to the right will contain less noise. It will look cleaner. So I personally use this technique quite a bit when out shooting, but there's something that you have to keep in mind, is that just like I said, that histogram that you have in the camera is being affected with all the capture image settings that you have set on the camera. So essentially you're again judging your exposing to the right technique looking at the histogram, and that's a major pitfall. Now, we wrote a really detailed article at photographylive.com where we explain all these pitfalls and how to get around them, and one of the workarounds is to try to get the histogram to look better without any of the adjustments. So you would basically have to turn off all the camera settings, vignetting control, and everything else that you have turned on, you would have to turn off. All the sharpening settings would have to go to 0. And by doing that, then you could look at more accurate histogram. But a lot of photographers don't like that because they actually rely a lot, just like myself, looking at images on the LCD and judging where you're at. So if everything like sharpness is gone, I might not understand, am I really getting the sharpest image while manually focusing? So for me, that might be a major problem. Now, my workaround around that, I still use exposing to the right technique when doing landscape photography, for example, because I want to get the best out of each digital camera that I use. So my technique is, again, going back to blinkies, is to utilize the blinkies. I will have the minimum settings turned on. So I'll have the standard picture control, I'll turn off active delighting and all these other settings, and I'll set my sharpening to a modest level. And then what I'll do is I'll look at the blinkies and decide, like in this scene, for example, and then I look at it, and if it's a normal exposure and I'm not getting anything blown out, then maybe I have some leg room to try to make the scene a little bit brighter. And then I'll just adjust my exposure, just looking at what I'm seeing in the exposure highlights here. So that works for me, and I know that it works for a lot of photographers out there, but my recommendation is to give that article that we published at Photography Life a read, see if it's worth doing it for you or not. I know that many portrait photographers, for example, don't particularly care for exposing to the right because they're far more worried about preserving the highlights, and they might not want to actually deal with going back in post-processing and editing every single image. So maybe for them, they just want to set one exposure in the camera and get it right as they're shooting. But for me, if I want to squeeze every bit of juice from the sensor in this camera, that's what I'm going to do. So give the article a read, decide for yourself whether that's worth it for you or not.